Boom, 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 literature gets a look. Legs talk about books. Hello and welcome to Legs Talk About Books, the monthly podcast where we talk about books. I am your host, Hardleg Joe. Joining me today, two men who have read books, I suppose. To my left, we have Bootleg Drew.
Hello.
And to his left, we have CB Radio.
It's just nice to be considered a man.
Yeah, you're considered a man around here. And this month's episode is looking at the science fiction comedy classic, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And also The Restaurant at the End of the Universe by Douglas Adams, because they kind of just go together. You can't read one without the other one. We didn't do the whole trilogy in a month, but we could do two. They're pretty short. And if you're new here, to start off, we sort of give spoiler-free thoughts, how we felt about the book, before jumping in to discuss it. I'm gonna throw it over Brandon. What did you think of these books?
I thought they were real fun. I had previously seen the movie, so it kind of, the first book overlaps quite easily and made it much easier to get through the first book. The second book, sadly, I did not quite finish. Yeah, I'm gonna be that guy who's just like, oh, that's what happened in the book?
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Hopefully you finish more books in the future episodes. It's kind of important for a book club.
It was a very stressful week, and so I should have done more, but I'm sorry.
But you still enjoyed what you did read.
I did enjoy what I did read. The comedy of it was very dry and British, and I like dry and British, and it's really interesting how he puts his inserts in there, and I like that.
Yes, you like your comedy like you like your toast, dry and British.
Yeah, and with a little bit of butter on top.
And I forget, did you had a scale, a recommendation scale, did you not, or have you abandoned that at this point?
I have not abandoned that at this point. This is definitely, because it's a classic, buy them.
Buy it book? You would recommend it?
I'd recommend buying the full compendium.
Yeah, all five main books.
Because it's much cheaper, well, not much cheaper. It's a lot easier, and you get the whole feel of his entire trilogy.
Quintilogy.
Yes.
Yeah, whatever you would call it. I think there's 6 of them now, but he didn't write the 6th one. Anyway, Bootleg Drew, what are your thoughts about this?
I heavily enjoyed these books. I thought they were fun. Again, dry and satirical is a very good formula for comedy. However, my only problem was just being able to kind of follow.
Yeah, it kind of jumps around a whole lot. Probably not the best for someone with ADD.
Yeah, it just, aside from that, once I got my bearings again, it was a fun ride.
Although I should note, you did read this. Normally you do audiobooks, but you actually did sit down and read these books.
I did sit down and actually read it.
It's weird because in a way I thought it's not the best because it jumps around, but at the same time it also doesn't fill it with a whole lot of flowery language. It's a very, concise book.
And it does fill the language with a very normal human tone.
It's colloquial.
Yes, thank you. For a better lack of
There's your $5 vocabulary word for the day. Colloquial. Written like normal language and such. And I guess it also does, in going with ADD, it kind of jumps around a lot, so I imagine it keeps your attention.
It was very good at keeping my attention.
It practically revels in its own disjointedness.
Yeah, it jumps around a whole lot. Although it does manage to keep a narrative, somewhat. The second book, it kind of goes off the rails for a little bit, but it eventually comes back to what it was doing.
Kind of?
Yeah, they do kind of take a really big tangent, but it's still good. As for me, same thing. I read this when I was a teenager. I reread it again. I still enjoyed it. There are more things that I remember now that I missed the first time around, that I'm like, now that I'm older, I appreciate it a lot more. It has one of my favorite metaphors in any book. I think it's a metaphor. It might be a simile. I forget. But yeah, if you just want something to read that's fun and entertaining, this is definitely that. It's got just enough subtext to it that if you do want to look a little bit deeper, it does have a little bit to say. It does have some points it can kind of make. It can make you think about some things, both on a philosophical level and just as a science fiction level. It has a lot of interesting concepts in it. The whole ship running on probability, really interesting. And if nothing else, you'll understand memes. We all know why 42 is important now. And why you should always bring a towel. I'm not sure if South Park was making a deliberate reference to that. Maybe it's just a coincidence.
Might be just a coincidence.
I just remember I went and saw the movie when I was a young lad on opening night because I had read the book a couple years earlier. Super excited. And I was surprised to see the super fans showing up, and they brought towels to the premiere.
That's fun.
Because towels are very important.
From what I've heard, it was not well received, so they may have been tying those towels around their faces.
I'm just gonna cut that part out, Brandon.
Alright.
I don't know why you would tie a towel around your face.
So you don't have to watch the video.
It's terrible. Anyway,
They
let's
do
jump
it. They
into
talk
it.
about doing that in the book.
So you don't have to see the basilisk. Okay, so with that all said, to everyone who's not read the book, from here on in, it's just spoiler territory. We don't really give a rundown of the plot or anything. In this show, we basically just talk about the interesting points that the book brings up, or interesting things that we got out of it. May have to do with actual plot points, may just be almost completely arbitrary. In the case of this first point, which is something I feel like we kind of have to start out with, just this idea, at least coming into the podcast that I had to think of, is, it's really hard to sort of critique any sort of comedy film, like in general, or to like analyze it, not on like its comedic merits. Obviously you could talk about whether the jokes worked or not, but it's one of those things where if you're talking about, does this moment mean anything? Does this symbolize anything? Or is this a plot hole? Or is this a problem of characterization? Almost every problem with this story could be chalked up to, it's like that because it's funny. Like, that's the only reason. It doesn't need an excuse to be anything else. And so, I don't know, what do you guys think about that idea?
I personally feel that analyzing comedy is something that is very, easy to do if it's just analyzing the joke and the merits of what made it a good joke. I think that you're also allowed to analyze it for what messages it might be saying, what the jokes might be trying to jab at. If it's a really well thought out satire, and it's clearly saying this thing in our society is ridiculous, that's a commentary that we can analyze and talk about why he thinks that thing is ridiculous, and why that joke might work better because this is actually ridiculous.
It's just weird sometimes, especially like when you talk about analyzing satire, is even within like the same thing, like a lot of times, especially when it comes to like political satire, you're watching like The Daily Show, or I guess what do the kids watch these days? John Oliver?
John Oliver.
Yeah, something like that. There's a fine line where this is clearly a joke that's meant to make you think about something, and this is a joke that's just a joke.
Right.
And just as a show that analyzes things, I do kind of have to bring up some of this stuff is a little bit of a reach. Some of this is sort of grasping at straws. Maybe we are trying a little too hard, but, you know, that's kind of what, it's just for fun.
It's what we do.
It's what we do.
It's good comedy to cut our teeth on.
Yeah. It's definitely not, I'm sure there are other satirical comedies that we could read that might be a little bit more complex.
I mean, even not reading, we could watch, like, South Park is actually an example of writers where at first you think, oh, it's just, you know, towel jokes and getting high.
Yeah.
But you look at an episode like the one where they crash on the marketplace and they just make a whole joke about what the economy is and refer it to God.
Yeah.
And, like, there's this whole tangent they go on that's just hilariously funny because if you overanalyze it and understand what they're making fun of, it's extremely funny. Otherwise, it just looks like they're just saying, like, oh, the economy is God and they're making Jew jokes.
Yeah. It is really weird, too, because I just side tangent about South Park, because it has this reputation for being really smart, and obviously it is in some ways. But I remember I had a girlfriend who had the DVDs, and we were listening to the commentaries, and I was surprised that, like, I distinctly remember they have the episode where there's a Virgin Mary statue, and, like, blood comes out of her vagina, and they're kind of making fun of all the fake miracles, like, oh, Jesus appeared on my toast and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then you hear them in the commentary, and someone asks them, like, so why did you choose that? And they're like, oh, we just thought it would be funny to have a statue that was, like, having its period. I'm like, I just thought there would be more to that. I thought there'd be some kind of symbolism, something you're trying to say.
Something that
No, we just thought it would be funny.
Some forethought that they would be putting into it. It's almost maybe a savantish situation.
Yeah.
Where they're just good at making jokes and the things they think are funny are easy to analyze.
Yeah, something like that. Brandon, what did you have to put in on the topic?
I got nothing.
Fair enough.
You've already said everything that I wanted to say. I wanted to say that comedy is really difficult, but it's also this double-edged sword of being, you can look at it as a shallow and just say, oh, that's funny because he said a fart or something like that. or you could actually pick it apart and it would just really blow things
What does
up.
the fart mean?
Yes. And you gotta watch out for those shallow and deep waters, because sometimes you're digging for gold in something that's just nowhere.
Sometimes you got your finger up the nose and you're just digging for a booger, and sometimes you're digging for gold, and if you dig too hard, you might just cause some damage. That's the best metaphor I've ever come up with. Thank you. Joe, make sure you include that in somewhere.
Please don't, for the merciful God, don't. That was bad.
So yes, moving on from analyzing comedy, the comedy in this, very distinctive, very, like, super dark comedy,
Yeah.
and at the same time, super absurd comedy. It's got a kind of lull randomness to it that you don't often see before the internet.
Which is, again, that form of specifically that it appeals to satire.
Yeah.
That satire is a form of comedy, takes the outrageous, making a statement about something, or pointing out something's outrageous by doing something even more outrageous.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's just the key. And Lovecraft did the same thing with horror, in the sense that taking the cosmic scale of, oh, that thing doesn't even notice you because you were completely insignificant to it.
Yeah. Which kind of leaves us into the whole thing I have written down here, is that, I've heard Hitchhiker's Guide called a Lovecraftian comedy. It's this comedy, it's about that same insignificance, about the absurdity of life, and yet, instead of being, this is terrifying, it's like, isn't that hilarious?
It also does use its dialogue kind of like Lovecraft and how it describes things. It doesn't like to describe things, and if it does, it throws as many, like, babbly words at you as possible, so that when you actually get all the information,
Yeah,
you're just as lost as everybody else.
I guess a little bit it does kind of take from his style, in that it has these moments of, we're going to describe something down to the minute inch like a scientist would,
Mm-hmm.
and then when it gets to alien stuff, it's like everyone has a name like Slarty Bartfast or like Zaphod Beetlebrox, or just like really long, impronounceable things that I have no idea how they pull off in the audiobook. But I don't think it's really the style that he's sort of emulating. It's more this idea that, like, the fact that we're insignificant in the universe could be funny, could be an opportunity of, like, freedom,
Yeah.
rather than something that's, like, scary or frightening.
Yeah, because Lovecraft used it from his own insecurity of his insignificance and displacement in the world. Therefore, you know, someone like that would write something that would truly terrify and cut to the core that you might share that fear. That's how good horror is written. Whereas comedy, same principle can be applied, except with levity instead of, you know, horror.
Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
What I was trying to say, and what I felt like, was that it seemed to revel in the idea of not knowing something, but knowing something, if that makes any sense.
No,
No, it doesn't.
not really.
It uses that.
The idea of mystery of the unknown is not frightening, it's exciting.
Mm-hmm.
It's, no one knows what's going on, and isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Isn't that, like, something that we should explore rather than something we should be, like, terrified at?
Yes. And that's where I get the Lovecraftian comedy in that sense.
It's weird talking to you guys just now. It actually reminds me of a monologue I heard from the Joker, because everything comes back to Batman. Why doesn't it?
Right.
But in one of his many comic incarnations, he talks about how the essence of humor is like a setup and then an unexpected twist.
Yeah.
Like, you think something's going to happen, and then something different happens, and isn't that funny? And he postulates that it's funny almost as like a self-defense mechanism. Something happens that your mind doesn't comprehend,
Therefore,
and so rather than break, it just sort of laughs. You're happy about it, because if you realized how absurd it was, you might be upset or angry about it. When you're talking about the Joker, he does that fine line between, what's the difference between being scared and laughing?
yes.
Sometimes when you're in extreme stress, people start laughing, they start cracking up.
Yeah.
He's very much like that. And this kind of takes this to the extreme, to the point where I don't think there's ever a part in this story where you're, like, afraid or scared or even, like, stressed. In fact, there's a point in here specifically where they start to go into a stressful, exciting action scene, and they specifically push all the brakes and tell you, missiles are about to be launched at our heroes. don't worry, none of them are gonna die. Everyone's gonna come out of it okay. Someone will sprain their ankle, though. And for the sake of tension, we won't tell you who that is. But don't worry, everything is gonna be fine.
Yeah, it gives you all the pieces, but tells you that nothing bad's going to happen with them.
Yeah, it's really weird how it can be so dark and at the same time, like, not dark.
Mm-hmm.
When you think of, have either of you ever seen the movie Brazil?
I've not.
Oh.
Neither have I.
Oh, well, it's an absurdist movie. Highly recommended. Has a lot of really cool effects. Has a lot of really funny moments. A lot of interesting sci-fi things. But the interesting thing about it is it's like a dark comedy, and it has like one of the darkest endings you could possibly imagine. And it's weird how like I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I know a lot of like dark comedies that end up like, and then everyone dies.
Like,
Cabin in the Woods.
Yes.
I've never seen it, but I've heard that like, it's kind of a horror, but it's also kind of a comedy.
Yeah, it's a little bit
It's
of
a
both.
dark comedy, and it doesn't end with like,
Everyone dying.
everyone dying, the world is like apocalyptic and stuff
Yeah.
like that, or it ends with the monster winning.
It's
Yeah.
all a satire towards and in love of horror movies. So yeah.
Yeah. There are a lot of horror movies that sort of try to ride that horror comedy angle. A lot of Friday the 13th sort of stuff. I wouldn't really call those dark comedies though. Those are like
No.
slasher films.
Those are slasher films that are just, because the way they do it was so absurd, it was supposed to be scary because like the effects had never been seen, but because it's so absurd and at this point they're so cheesy that it's hard not to laugh.
Yeah. Or like if you look at like the Freddy Krueger movies, like the first two, very scary. And then the third one, he's like, I love the power glove, and he turns a guy into a video game and like jumps him off a cliff or whatever. It's like, this is clearly a horror comedy.
Yeah.
Except at the end, like everyone dies.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
feel like a better example of that is the Evil Dead franchise, where it starts off as trying to be
A straight horror. The first one is a straight horror.
then it blends into horror comedy, and then it just went full action comedy.
Action comedy, essentially. And yeah, those ones always have, like, kind of a good ending, but also bad stuff happens. But also the bad guy is still alive. But yeah, so it's just interesting to have something that rides that line and at the same time has absolutely zero tension through most of the story. Like, even the mysteries it brings up, like you said, are more like, oh, that's kind of interesting, like Zaphod's brain having parts of it erased by himself in the past, and he doesn't know why. It's not this, like, burning question, it's just more like, huh, neat. I wonder if they'll do that later.
And the best
Probably. Maybe not.
And the best way they use to describe it is a lot of the characters' reactions, like Zaphod's, is just, hey, there's this thing in the back of my brain that's been taken out. I don't care.
Yeah. I don't really care about what past me did. Past me was an asshole. All I know is current me wants to get drunk, so I am perfectly fine with doing that. But yeah, I guess to turn that around to make that into a question, do you guys in the chat, do you think that works? Do you think it's fine for a story to try to remove all of its tension? Because I remember that was one of the things that, like, I guess the first time I read it, I didn't really notice it, and then the second time I was like, oh, well that's slightly disappointing. I was, like, looking forward to a little bit of action. This has all been, like, dull British talkie comedy so far.
I don't mind the dull British talkie comedy for a whole movie, to be honest, because so many movies, especially, like, my parents and siblings all love any Will Ferrell movie.
Yeah.
Will Ferrell movies are like, gold in our house.
They're American laughing, yelly comedy.
Yeah, laughing, yelling comedy where it's like, they just go out there, Will Ferrell does something ridiculous, maybe pulls out a gun or something and shoots his own ankle.
Yeah.
And it's like everyone loses their sides. I almost can't stand that now because, like, outrageous comedy is so boring to me. It's like,
it's been so overplayed over the years.
It's so overplayed. It's so easy to overplay, in a sense.
Well, not only that, but you do kind of bring up a good point. Like, even in these movies that are supposed to be completely absurd comedies, like, Talladega Nights still has a legit, like, race at the end where they try to bring up tensions. Like, Elf still has, like, its set piece on the sleigh and everything.
Exactly.
Like, a lot of American media and a lot of, like, just modern media in general, sort of like, yeah, every movie has to have a love story in it.
Or
it's
like
not a story if you don't put a shoehorned love interest into it.
Or the other guys with Will Ferrell and Mark
Zuckerberg.
Mark Wahlberg, where they where again, just like ridiculous action set piece and like tension after tension.
Yeah.
Just to be funny, like, oh, how absurd, how did they keep getting in this situation? Whereas the original British Office, something I enjoy a lot now, because I like, it's clever, it's funny, but it doesn't try so hard to be funny.
Yeah.
It just kind of naturally is funny, and like, that makes me sound...
It's very realistic funny.
It makes me sound almost elitist, and it makes me feel elitist saying it. But it's true. It's like too easy to laugh at all that.
Comment in the comments, is Bootleg Drew an elitist?
It's okay, Bootleg Drew. You are elitist.
Oh, I thought you had a joke there or something.
Yeah,
you had the joke, you already made it.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Now it's just awkward. Now there's just this big silence.
Now we've taken the tension out of it.
I'm here to kick ass and eat spaghetti.
Speaking of side tangents...
Please take that out of that.
What? I like the spaghetti joke. The spaghetti joke is staying in. If it's not staying in, then this tangent about the spaghetti joke is staying in, and no one will understand it except you two.
I'm not worried about the spaghetti joke. I'm worried about the sound of eating into the wall.
ASMR is pretty popular.
I don't like ASMR. Let's get out of this.
But yeah, speaking of side tangents, as Bootleg Drew said, and a thing that's probably cut, this book has a lot of them. This book has a lot. Stop laughing, Brandon! Trying to get a take here. You're just barely containing it, and I know as soon as I say anything.
What are you doing, man?
I'm laughing
We got a show to run.
Here,
this isn't a
this.
comedy show.
I mean, it kind
show.
of is. It's supposed to be a little
It's supposed to be a dialogue.
Yeah, it's a little of both. We could be entertaining from time.
Just saying.
Yeah. This book has a lot of tangents. It's like probably 30% tangents. It loves the whole conceit of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is that at any point they could be like, oh, Vogon poetry? Here, let me read you the entry for what the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy says about Vogon poetry. And they just spend like 3 pages talking about not only it, but other poetry from other parts of the galaxy and like humorous stories that have to do with it. And it really, really works for this. I think we all agree.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I do like that at the beginning it starts to set up these entries, and then halfway through the book just decides to throw it out.
Yeah.
And just says, hey, we're just gonna go off on the tangents.
I mean, even the book starts with a tangent. The book starts with like, here's a story of a young woman who finally learned all these things, and the world was going to make sense, and then she died. This story is not about her, it's about Arthur Dent. He lives in a small pub in England. And it works perfectly for this, and it's so weird because not only there's 2 things. Family Guy does tangents, a lot of things do tangents, and they're almost universally criticized for them. A lot of people have problems with comedy that just sort of goes off and does its own thing for a little bit and then comes back to the plot. And even comedy aside, almost any writing course you take, almost anything you learn about writing, whether it be for movies, TV, books, whatever, is going to go the less is more angle. You know, the Chekhov's gun. If you show a gun in Act 1, it better be fired in Act 3. If not, why is it there?
Right.
You know, if the curtains are blue because they symbolize his depression. If they're not, then why are the curtains there? Do they have a reason to be there? Then just take them out if it doesn't mean anything. And this kind of goes into that whole, it doesn't matter. We're just gonna throw in whatever and it works perfectly, and I don't quite understand why.
I personally, as a person who enjoys the tangents and kind of zaniness of just, oh, well, we were going to tell you a story, but now we're going to tell you 3 other stories, and then we're going to remember, because it's so natural to my natural ADD, I almost don't see why other stories don't do that. Like, that's how I tell a story, so why doesn't other media do it?
Yeah, like, I could take a break from whatever and go do some stuff. Why not?
Exactly. And then come back and perfectly remember, oh, that's right, I was doing this. Let me finish telling you about why we started and went off on that huge adventure in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of side tangents about side tangents, I recently finished reading American Gods by Neil Gaiman, which probably won't have an episode about it. I'm thinking of doing mini-sodes.
Oh, cool.
But regardless, it has these little tangents where it's telling a story about a person, And then in between chapters, they'll have these points where they tell a story about, like, an immigrant who came over and they believed in pixies and all this interesting stuff kind of worked out for them.
Right.
And there's somewhat magic. And I get that it's sort of like building up how the mythology works a little bit. But after, like, the first two, it's like, I get it. You have a 20-page thing about, like, a slave brought over, and it kind of shows how voodoo is introduced. And it's like, voodoo doesn't play a part in the story. And those are honestly, like, the weakest part of the book, and I kind of hate them. I guess hate's kind of a strong word, but I really didn't enjoy reading them. I felt like they could have been cut out of the story entirely, and it wouldn't have been the same.
Well, it's a little different in a sense, because it's taking away from, it's not adding to. And that's what I think the most important part, rounding back to from a literature perspective, it doesn't actually add anything to the story. But it does, though. It adds, like, character world building. It adds interesting tidbits that you wouldn't know otherwise following the story.
It gives you an idea of how the universe works.
Exactly. Without actually having to tell you, oh, this is, without having to take them to that spot and actually experiencing it. The side tangents work because it's just character building and world building without actually having to establish that in like a 5-second thing.
Yeah.
Basically.
Brandon?
I just think that if you do a tangent like those ones in this book and in other books, that it really, like you said, should facilitate world building and possibly a little bit of the plot.
Yeah.
And if it's funny, it can distract you from less savory parts of the story. I wouldn't say savory, more of enjoyable parts.
Yeah, when things are dragging a little bit, they're gonna be like, hey, let's throw in some funny ha-has to liven up the pace or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just weird. It's one of those things, like, I understand it. I understand that it does stuff. But at the same time, the, like, rational part of my brain is just like, but couldn't you find some diegetic way to include it into the narrative or something? It just seems, like, kind of lazy.
That's what makes it outrageous, bud.
Completely outrageous.
Yeah, I think it's so weird how often, like, I'll come to this podcast and bring up a question where I'm like, is this good or is this bad? And at the end, the answer is always, if it's done right, anything can be good.
Exactly. But that's the problem with literature, is that any literature and, media experiment can go really well and be influential. Only if done right, or if the circumstances are so that they are met in irreplaceably or irredeemably good quality.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why I'm drawn to media and, like, talking about media, analyzing it, is because we inherently want to put up rules. And there are a lot of rules. There are some things that you almost, like, can't do, or that, like, 99% of the time you should adhere to this rules. But every time I think there's a rule, there's an exception to it somewhere.
There's always an exception to a rule.
Exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, I forget if we talked about this in other things, but we're talking about tangents, so I might as well go on a tiny tangent. Are any of you familiar with train spotting?
Yes.
Train spotting? No.
No.
Tell me more about this.
Have you seen the movie or the book?
Have I seen the book? I have not seen the movie, nor have I read the book, but I know of the film, and I know of a couple things that happen in it.
Trainspotting is one of 2 books that I tried to read and gave up on, like, chapter 1.
Oh, wow.
Damn.
I've slogged through a lot of bad books in my time. But there's only 2 that I've given up. One was...
Wait, I remember this. I remember you telling me about when you gave up on it.
Yeah.
I remember this. This was terrible.
I showed you an example, didn't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing about Trainspotting is it's about rural English, like, drug addicts in the early 90s.
I think you told me about this.
And a lot of it is dialogue from them, and it's written as they would say it. It's written, like, phonetically.
Right.
So it's a lot of, like, then may you go down to the telly, get yourself a scroll. And he just got, like, a bunch of dashes and hyphens and misspelled words, like, everywhere. It's everything that, like, I hate. And all these literary people are like, oh, it's a work of masterpiece. It works. It fills out. Later on, when he learns to speak better, the difference is such night and day, and it makes you appreciate the written word. And I'm like, but I can't understand it to begin with. It frustrates me so much. It's one of those examples where I read this, and I was told it was an exception to the rule, and I'm like, no. The rule is, you write in actual English, and there's a reason for it. And I cannot get into anything that, like, deviates from that rule.
Have you read Clockwork Orange?
Yeah, but they just have slang. Slang interspaced is different from, like, writing entire sentences with different words.
That's...
At least to me, I don't know.
That's like when I tried to read a book in Spanish. Even when I was fluent in Spanish. It was still frustrating as hell. So to do a different dialect of English, written out, where it's supposed to be a frenetic, different form of speaking, that now I have to translate into my head, from the page, into sound, so that way I could understand, oh, he's supposed to be Cockney.
Yeah.
So now I understand.
I have to say it out loud to understand. It's one of those, I think, it's one of those things where I feel like, if you're going to do something with how people speak, it should be in a medium where you can hear people speak.
Yes.
Like, it probably works a lot better as a movie, where you can hear them talk, and then you understand.
Like, The King's Speech would be a garbage book.
Yeah. It'd be full of stuttering and all this, like, awful thing.
The King's Speech.
Ah, yes.
It'd be a garbage book because it'd be full of stuttering and bad, proper English.
Yeah. I don't know. Again, it's a weird side tangent, but it does kind of bring up this point of, what are the rules of literature, the rules of media for you, that you think can't be broken no matter what? For me, it's that, this, I thought it was like tangents, but after rereading this, I realized, like, no, tangents can work. When I'm writing my own stuff, I should maybe consider throwing in a couple tangents from here and there.
There's a rule for me in literature. It's a strange rule because it's not as, like, hard to pin down. A story, especially for TV, because I was a big TV guy, and especially anime, never do something wacky if you take yourself seriously as a show.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a serious story, if you're trying to tell a serious story about a young upstart, gentleman growing up in an English mansion.
You shouldn't have a beach episode.
You shouldn't have a beach episode where the dude, sees huge boobs and, makes a face, because that's not gentlemanly. And you know what? I'm about to spoil your day, because you know what rule anime especially breaks that goddamn rule so hard that it flexes and creates a new creature? JoJo's goddamn Bizarre Adventure. Fuck that show. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is one of those shows where I watched it, and it took itself so seriously, yet did itself so ridiculously that I couldn't really care.
Yeah.
I couldn't bring myself to care about Joseph Joestar, because everything he did was ridiculous, but the way he did it was so I'm going to impale this man upon a spike, because he impugned my father's honor. And I'm like, that's the most ridiculous sentence. Do you not realize how ridiculous you're being, Joestar?
Insert cherries.
Yeah, there's a lot of fucking ridiculousness about that show that I just don't appreciate because the way it set itself up in the beginning.
Yeah, it's one of those, I'm fine with dark comedies, I'm fine with sort of lighthearted adventure.
Yeah.
But comedy adventure and comedy horror just doesn't do it for me.
No.
You gotta be one or the other.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
The only movie...
Scrubs is another thing that makes me, it takes itself too seriously, but also tries to be really funny. And, I know that's could be an exception to the rule for some people, but that, in my rule, it follows that rule, where, it takes itself too seriously to be funny.
I'm sorry to say, but I think the world of both of those things. I really like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, simply because...
Scrubs.
And Scrubs. Well, Scrubs, because it reminds me a bit of MASH, which is another show that was it took itself seriously.
It was a comedy in the Vietnam War.
In the Korean War. But it took itself seriously at points, and then also comedy at some points that were rather funny. And it's just because the entire levity of the situation would be oppressive in both scenarios of a hospital or of a war hospital, that I feel like the comedy is really good to break it up.
To me, as someone who kind of enjoyed Scrubs, but didn't really get all that into it, I haven't really gotten into any, live action TV show. I was never a TV guy.
Right.
But if I was playing devil's advocate for this, I would say to that something like Dr. House, where it takes itself seriously, and Dr. House can still be comedic. It could still have its funny moments,
but it doesn't go
they never break into
tangents.
They never break into song and dance.
Yeah, or they have what's his name? The two doctors show up in pimp outfits.
Yeah.
That's not, like, that's the difference between a comedy and a comedic bit.
That's an internal monologue, though.
But that doesn't excuse the fact that the show's about an intern dealing with the realities of a hospital.
We're like, okay, if I was going to play devil's advocate for Brandon now, though, well, what about, like, the episodes of Family Guy where, like, Brian dies? Or, like, the Stewie and Brian episode where suddenly it decides to take itself super seriously?
I think those are garbage episodes, personally.
Oh, okay. At least you're consistent.
Yeah, I really hated the Brian died episode. I actually liked the part where he died, because they did it in a really stupid way. But generally, I find that, like, because they, like, yes, it was a writing experiment, then they took it back, in the next episode, I'm like, no, fuck you, Family Guy writers.
I thought they took it back, like, 3 episodes later.
It was whatever. It was enough episodes that it wasn't long enough to really be a lasting thing.
It wasn't a whole season.
Yeah, it wasn't a whole season, and it was just like, again, like, those are the episodes I skipped past.
Oh, okay. But yes, non-Hitchhikers things aside, if I even included all those non-Hitchhikers tangents.
I want my stance on JoJo's to be very firm.
As firm as JoJo's rift chest. The Babelfish.
Yes.
Which is, again, kind of a tangent thing, but it's a tangent that made you think about something, that actually brought up an interesting thing. And if you're unfamiliar with it, I guess I'll tell you the basic idea. Babelfish, little fish, you put it in your ear, it feeds off ambient sounds and then excretes intelligible language into your brain.
It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous, but it's a great way to explain why all these disparate races with disparate ways of talking can understand each other. Everyone just has a Babelfish.
Right.
But they make an almost throwaway line at the end of the explanation about it, saying, by ensuring universal communication, the Babelfish has been responsible for more untold wars and bloodshed than any individual species in the history of the universe.
And I think that is a brilliant philosophical look at communication and how communication, especially at today's speed, because this was written in the 70s, the communication at today's speed, where we can understand each other far better than we've ever been able to understand each other before, and yet accurately, there is far more violence and, like, war. There's, like, so much more aggression between that communication.
I don't know, it's difficult to actually measure how much violence, from everything I've seen, the amount of, like, violence in the world is actually going down.
Well, I mean,
just so that we know about it more.
Right.
But yeah, it's still the idea that in the 70s there was this idea that if we all just sort of understood each other, if we all communicate perfectly, we would get along. And not even, like, different languages, just the fact that, like, you know, a rural person talking to someone who was raised really wealthy might use different vocabulary, and they'd have trouble understanding what they were talking about and what they wanted.
Right.
And the Babelfish cures that perfectly, because it doesn't matter what you say, the meaning gets translated to your brain.
But also it brings to the point, like, you now understand everyone perfectly. You understand the intentions of that person, in a sense. Which is bad if someone's trying to trick you.
Yeah, not even tricking. It's just the idea that, like, you know, back then it was this idea like, we all want safety and security. We just go about it in different ways. And the Babelfish comes along and is like, no, you're just completely incompatible. And by making it clear that you are completely incompatible, you make it clear that you have to fight to resolve your problems.
Right.
Which is like, yeah, it's kind of like the internet. I remember, especially me growing up in, like, the early 90s, like, when the internet was really in its infancy.
Right.
And you would hear all this stuff about, oh, now we can communicate with people across the world, and this is going to bring people together, and people are, like, from all these different societies are learning things. And what's happened is, all the disparate people in the world have divided themselves into separate little groups based on their beliefs, and they just hate all the other groups.
Yeah.
Regardless, it's like, oh yes, now conservative-minded thinkers and liberal-minded thinkers, regardless of what country they're in, can get together to agree that the other is assholes.
High school was right.
High school was right. We do need to be at separate tables.
Yes. Exactly.
Ooh, could you imagine if high school just had one giant round table that all the students sat at?
I would have walked across that table so many times and would have gotten into so many fights over it.
You know how much of, like, a literal pie graph that's gonna look like? all of like the preppy kids sitting at one corner, and that's
It'd be interesting, because I remember I was friends with nerds and skaters, so I'd be on, like, the line between the two.
Well, you had kids like you, like, bordering the lines, and you'd have the rest of the punks in between those.
And then you have me, who's sitting at the vending machine on the other side of the country.
No, you'd be in... Everyone has to sit at the table.
Everyone has to sit at the table.
That's the conceit.
I choose not to sit at the table.
You can't choose not to! Then perish!
But all I wanted was to sit away.
But yeah, just that idea in general, down in the comments. Do you think that communication or inability to communicate is still a problem? Do you think that the ability to communicate would actually create more problems? Philosophical time here.
Philosophical time.
Yeah. Brandon, did you have any thoughts on the matter, by the way? We kind of left you out of that.
Well, you've already thrown, again, like, everything that's happened in this entire discussion. You guys have already hit all the points. I pretty much find it that if you understand each other's intentions, and if they aren't compatible, that's still something that can be resolved to agree to disagree. So I don't think that it should.
Yeah, or I guess you could find a compromise or something like that.
The only accessible point is not war. There is more.
Yeah, war's really easy though.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's kind of fun. I mean, depending on if you're the general who orders the people to fight, you don't actually have to get shot at.
Or if you really like shooting at people.
You're like, oh, all the tactics and everything, I can move these tanks over here and they'll never see them.
and they'll never see them, but boy howdy will we see them.
And then you don't think about, like, the guy in the tank who's getting shot at.
He's just like, oh, jeez, Chief, we're getting shot at real bad in here.
But yeah, as for another tangent, you had another little point, another tangent that you thought was particularly interesting, especially now in this day and age.
Yes, was President Zaphod, and the fact that every time he got on to the screen, we'll call it, every time he got on screen, he did something wacky, right?
Yeah.
After the media always, were questioning and gabbing him for something important, and he'd be like, no, I don't believe I will be getting drunk tonight, but I am stealing the ship, kind of thing.
He would just... Well, it's the whole idea that they set him up as the president of the universe.
Right.
And then they immediately tell you that the president of the universe has no actual power.
Right.
That their entire job is to basically distract people from their problems.
Right, and no one was better at distracting them than a two-headed alien.
Yeah. I mean, well, everyone was aliens in the universe.
Right,
but it's just the fact that, like, Zaphod was the kind of guy... He spent the first 3 years of his 10-year presidency in prison.
Yeah. So, like, originally, was it just a zany joke about maybe looking into American politics or British politics at the time? Or is it a weird kind of prophecy that has come to unfold upon us in modern-day politics?
It's strangely prophetic in the sense that I follow a couple more neutral news commentators. Right. And they make a point of how, like, however you feel about Trump, he does say controversial things.
Yes.
Like, whether you personally find them controversial, you can't admit the news cycle talks about it.
Right.
And there's this sort of trend where some serious problem happens, maybe someone's testifying about something, or maybe there's, like, some problem with the camps or whatever, and then Trump will go on Twitter and tell, like, a black congresswoman to go back to her home country, even though she's from America.
Right.
And suddenly everyone's just talking about, oh, this racist tweet, and arguing over whether or not it's racist or whatever. And all he's done is completely distract you from the fact that there's a more serious problem going on.
There's a very more serious problem.
And whether or not he does that specifically to distract you, or whether or not he just...
is a wacky person.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
But the point being that, yeah, President Zaphod is a weirdly well-written version of what we have today.
Yeah, like, Trump really feels kind of Zaphodish in how outrageous that he can be.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a reality show TV star.
Yeah, exactly.
And now he's the president. And that's almost exactly what Zaphod was, I believe. And it's an idea of, like, when it comes to jokes like this, like you said, was this something that he was commentating on British politics? And it just, like, history repeats itself?
Yeah.
Was it a completely absurd joke where at the time he was just like, what would be the most absurd thing for the president to do? What if they were just a distraction? Ha ha ha.
And now we're like, oh.
And now it's like, oh, this thing has actually kind of happened.
Yeah. it's a little frightening in the way that joke happened. But I think, yeah, it's definitely, I would look into that. Tell us if you think, what you think on that.
Obviously, I don't know anything about British politics in the 70s and 80s, so I can't tell you for sure.
Yeah.
Pretty sure Margaret Thatcher was involved. I hear a lot of jokes about her.
Right.
But as far as, like, is it history repeating itself, or is it just, like, strangely pathetic? I don't know. That's the thing, is I'm pretty sure I've heard about stuff like this before,
right.
But I don't know if that was, like, actual history, like if you have things of kings who had problems with the treasury and was like, start a war with the French. The French are evil devils and we must unite to fight them.
Yes.
Forget about your debts.
Yes.
I don't know if that's actually something that happened in history a lot, or if that's something that later historians or later story writers have made into a thing.
Right.
And then, like, life is imitating art.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone took inspiration from this book because it's such a comedy.
Yeah.
But I could see how someone took that idea, made it into a legitimate story, and maybe that inspired someone.
Yeah. But yeah. Anyway, tell us what you think.
And talking about leadership, that brings me to the final point, which is probably the only part in this story that you could, I think, take somewhat seriously, that you could analyze, and that is the ruler of the universe.
Ah, yes.
Who is, again, if you haven't seen it, which I kind of assume you have, but he's this guy who doesn't believe in anything. They go on this short tangent talking about the people who want power are the people who are the least likely to use it well. Usually the people who crave power are the most likely to abuse it. What you need to do is find someone who is hardworking, who doesn't want to be in power, and have them solve your problems. And this is basically taking that to the extreme.
Right.
Because you have a guy living in a shack with a cat who is like, I like to believe that men came and talked and asked me about the problems of the universe, but perhaps I dreamed it. Or perhaps they did come, but they were yodeling to my cat, and I just thought they were asking me questions. And he's like the complete opposite of, like, he's talking from such a detached perspective that he could sort of give these very grounded answers.
Right.
And I guess the big thing about it is, it's really hard to tell from the way he writes it if this is a good thing or a bad thing. Is he saying, like, yes, what we need is people who don't want to be in power. We shouldn't have politicians who are playing this game to be in charge.
Right.
Or if he's saying, like, or if he's making fun of the people who say that by being like, oh, you want a detached ruler? You want a not politician? You think there's something better than democracy? This is your alternative. This is the true philosopher king, and it's completely absurd and awful.
From the satiricalist perspective, it would be easier to say he's just trying to make fun of the philosopher king notion, because that's what makes most sense from what he's already written and what we've already talked about.
Yeah, he's poking fun at Socrates.
Yeah, that he's poking fun at, well, everyone.
Yeah.
In a sense. He's poking fun at the politicians by having Zaphod. He's poking at the philosopher king people by having the actual rule of the universe. Like, he's covering two birds with one stone, really.
Yeah.
And he's actually making fun of a lot of other science fiction tropes where it's like, but the shady whatever government actually runs the government. Yeah. Yeah, but he's covering...
They do, but they run the government by asking an old man in a shack what he
exactly.
thinks.
So, like...
just something that popped into my mind once you said that, all these inverse tropes, is kind of the idea that Arthur, the main character, is literally the inverse of a lot of sci-fi tropes of the man who is prepared.
Yeah. He is, in a lot of ways, he's sort of like the anti-hero.
Yeah. And by the, not anti-hero as in like a Deadpool, like, oh, I'm edgy, no, or funny, more like he's literally like not ready to be a hero.
Or I guess less of,
joke.
less of the anti-hero, but more of the reluctant hero.
Yeah.
Antithesis hero.
Yeah, what I've actually heard him compared to, Frodo Baggins in a lot of ways, where they're both just sort of like, I just want to chill out in my house, and now I've got to go do all these things, and I don't want to do these things, but I guess I will. But yeah, that is also, Frodo kind of brings up, he is that same idea.
Yeah.
Gandalf can't take the ring because he wants power a little bit. Like, no one who wants the ring can have it.
Right.
Only someone who wants to be alone can.
Yeah, and so, like, again, you can make fun of all these tropes, but I think at the end of the day, a statement could be made that maybe it's best if we don't question it. And I know that sounds like the kind of like defeatist philosophy in a sense, but if you want change, strive for it, of course. If you want, to be the, rebel that, changes everything, go ahead. But unless you're truly prepared, and I always talk to this about my friend who is very good at heart, but is always kind of like, man, we should just like dismantle the government. I'm like, but what are you going to replace it with? Like, what's your idea?
Dismantle the establishment,
yeah.
board by board.
And I'm like, that's great, but what are you rebuilding in its place? So, unless you have a better system or a better idea, don't fix what isn't essentially broken. Like, yes, you could say it's broken all day, but if we're still not living in, living in the forest, eating our own, feces or whatever, we're good.
I don't want to eat feces.
Yeah, exactly.
Comment in the comments.
You know what I mean, though? It's
Yeah.
like, I'm not saying give up or like don't try to change things for the better. I'm just saying don't try to like just jump into something because you think it needs to be changed without actually thinking about how you're going to change it.
Yeah, there's a famous old quote that I always get wrong, but it kind of mixes with this well. That's sort of like, I believe it's like a prayer, and it's like, give me the strength to change the things that need to be changed, and the willpower to tolerate the things I can't change.
Right. You did butcher that, but I do know exactly the prayer you're talking about.
Yeah.
And the third and most important part is the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah,
Yes.
the wisdom to know which is which.
Yeah.
Like, some things are worth fighting for, but not all the things.
Yeah, not
You can't be
everything.
fighting all the time. But yeah, it is weird how it does kind of come back. It comes back to our very first point.
Yeah.
Like, you could say a whole lot of stuff about the leader of the universe.
Yeah.
He's the most interesting part of the first two books.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you could just be like, yeah, but it's funny.
Yeah.
Like, what if, like, who's the leader of the universe? Some guy in a shack on a meteor who says nothing's real. And then the scientists look at it and they're like, yeah, we studied it. Turns out he's wrong.
Yeah, it is real. Yeah.
Stuff is real. Scientists later confirm.
Yeah.
I believe that, yeah, that's the exact joke
Yeah.
earlier. Scientists later found that man to be lying.
But yeah.
But yeah, so that just leaves us to our final question. Kind of a joke question, but I went to the patrons. I'm trying to make this a little bit more interactive.
Right.
Now that we've got more people, we're up to like 400 subscribers.
Neat.
Hey, if you're watching this later on and we have like 100,000, write down in the comments how many subscribers we have now. Right now it's like 400. But I asked them on the Discord, like, hey, did you have any questions you want to ask us? Did you have any points of interest? And the only thing they came up with is, what do you think of 42? And Brandon had an answer. We were talking about this earlier.
It's just a silly little answer of, it's just the inverse of my birthday.
Oh, I thought you were going to be the whole, like, you liked the idea that it was how many paths must a man walk.
I liked that one. That one's a fun one, but it's also kind of the most obvious, hey, let's make a self-help book. And
Yeah,
make it,
why not?
Why not? How many?
42 points to changing your life.
Mm-hmm.
And, Drew, did you ever think of anything? Or do you think it's just nonsense?
How many trash can nights we can have?
It used to be for the old me, it would be how many bottles
How many shots?
How many shots does it take till a man meets his end?
How many ounces can hold your life?
Yeah, but I think the real meaning of 42 is honestly, it's hard to say because it's just a number.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a number. Don't think too hard about it. I think he's literally with 42 making a comment about. Basically, you could spend your whole life dissecting 42, finding the mathematical answer, creating Earth to simply create the question that will give you the meaning to this
Behind
answer.
42.
But at the end of the day, I personally have started to live under the philosophy that you just gotta keep living. Like, if you keep yourself distracted with questions like 42, like, yes, it's fun, and it's fun to ponder.
Yeah.
But if you, like, spend your life going, man, what does 42 mean? And then you miss out on all the other opportunities.
What could you have done with those 8 million years in the
Yeah.
biggest computer rather than just coming up with 42?
Exactly.
Played so much
like,
Minecraft.
Or, other productive things. but that's my point, is that, I love 42 and I hate 42 in the sense that, 42 can be anything.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be anything.
I think that's kind of the point, is sort of like the question of what is the meaning of life.
Yeah.
It's what you make of it.
Yeah.
What does 42 mean? Is it, if you believe there is some sort of structure to the universe, then yeah, the idea of like, how many paths must a man walk? That seems like something that you want to do. It seems like there are challenges and you can complete it when you get to a certain point.
It could be 42 bottles of different alcohol.
Yeah. There's like, it's possible that the whole number is just absurd. It's random.
Right.
If you want to believe that life has no meaning, that it has no purpose, that it's all just chaos and you've got to make whatever, 42 works perfectly.
Chaos. Yeah.
But it's odd. They do give you an answer at the end of the second book. I'm not sure if you remember that part.
Dude, I didn't remember 42, so I'm bad at reading, so please enlighten
You
me
forgot
again.
about the 42.
Yeah.
At the very end, when they're back on ancient Earth, there's time travel shenanigans. Sorry, Brandon, I'm spoiling a little bit.
I don't doubt that. They already did time travel shenanigans on them being in the end of
Restaurant
the
universe.
at the universe,
yeah. So they time travel.
Place.
They end up crash landing on ancient Earth with a bunch of aliens that are just awful.
Mm.
And they find the original inhabitants of Earth were actually the Neanderthals, and that they died out, and that all the humans are descendants of these aliens who were just awful. And so Arthur, in an attempt to sort of just make whatever out of life, he gets a bunch of stones and he makes Scrabble. And they realize, like, hey, Arthur, you're part of this Earth, you're connected to it. It's possible you are an original human. You were there right when it ended. So they're like, maybe you could know. And they have him reach into the Scrabble bag and pull out letters at random. And it just happens to spell out, what is 6 times 7? 42. And so there's this idea, like, as absurd as that is, where it's just like, oh, what is 6 times? Well, duh, obviously. Yeah. It also sort of lines to the opposite of the universe being chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the meaning of life? Like, life just is. Like, it's numbers. It's 6 times 7. The Earth exists because it exists.
Yeah, because it was created by people who wanted it to be in existence.
Yeah. Like, it's sort of like, it almost doesn't matter what philosophy you have. It's sort of this thing like, it is what it is, and you should appreciate it for what it is, rather than trying to derive meaning from it existing, or trying to find a purpose for it.
Which is funny that I have this philosophy, but then I have this hardcore rule about things must be as they state themselves to be.
Yeah.
At least in media. I don't care about real people, like, being, like, outrageous for, like, and out of character. Like, they're just developing as a person.
Yeah.
Or trying to develop. Like, but a TV show establishes itself and its nature from day one.
That's one of the really weird things about, and here's one final tangent. Just because I kind of want to talk to you guys about this, and this is something I always kind of bring up, is the inherent, like, fakeness of media.
Yeah.
Like anything, we talk about character as being out of character or acting in a way you don't expect.
Right.
And when it comes to real life, people do all sorts of weird shit you don't understand.
Yeah.
I quit my job once because I had a bad dream about it. Like, I'm a fairly logical guy who believes in science and stuff and hard work. There's no reason, if I was a character in a book and I quit my job because of a dream after 30 years of acting fairly rationally, you would be like, what the fuck was that? Who wrote a character like that?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's this idea that, like, yeah, the more structured you make your stories, the less true to life they become.
Yeah.
And in that way, all media is kind of, like, inherently a lie.
Yeah.
And one thing I always wanted to sort of bring up, since we're talking about space aliens, I had this sort of, like, gem of an idea for a story about humans meeting with aliens. And the aliens are like, they're advanced, and they're like, we'd like to welcome you into our galaxy, but you're not yet mature enough. You haven't rid your planet of fiction. They're like, art is a disease. It makes you believe things that aren't real. You're telling each other lies, and every bit of it is some kind of propaganda to make you believe something that isn't actually real. Until you can get rid of all of that, you aren't prepared to be a race in the Galactic Federation.
So the Galactic Federation is basically ultimate logic.
Yeah. Well, not even ultimate logic. They're like, you can have fun, you can enjoy, like, a sunset for its own sunset, but you have to see that sunset. If someone paints it, it's not that sunset anymore.
Ah.
It's someone else making something that's not real.
Gotcha.
Yeah, skateboarding isn't specifically an art, but if you enjoy doing it.
Yeah, it's fine to do some frivolous things. It's fine to
Right.
enjoy, like,
Okay.
they might still believe in love. They just don't believe in love stories because it paints this picture of love that isn't real.
Over-romanticized, or yeah.
Yeah.
Music?
Yeah, same thing. I don't know. That'd be hard to judge.
Hard to quantify.
Yeah, it's not completely fleshed out, but it's just this interesting idea that I came up with, sort of like, in every fiction almost, humans are sort of like, oh, our main strength is our creativity.
Yes.
Our main strength is the fact that we have art, that we have logic.
Our ability to think outside the box.
I've seen so many stories where, like, you find primitive life, and they prove that they're intelligent because they paint, or because
Right.
they make art. And what if it was the opposite? What if we got there and they're like, you would be great if only you could get rid of this obsession with falseness.
Right.
This obsession with telling each other lies and claiming that it's noble.
That's interesting. I like it.
Like, someday I'll write a science fiction epic and that will be
Yeah.
one of the main races.
Nice.
Any thoughts on that, Brandon? Do you think it's interesting or do you think it's dumb?
Only lies from me. Only lies.
Only lies from Brandon. All communication is lies. Joe, keep that in, even if you remove that tangent. The people must know. Communication is inherently a lie.
As they tear it off of your channel.
By the way, Lovecraft for Halloween.
Lovecraft for Halloween, yes. So that pretty much does it for this episode. Next month, though, we're going to be doing some Lovecraft. We haven't decided exactly on which stories yet.
Right.
Maybe they'll choose us.
Yeah, well, I was thinking we gotta read, Call of Cthulhu.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the classic one. I've read a whole lot. I figure we each pick one.
Okay.
I want to read The Color of Outer Space. You guys can look at some of the titles, pick one.
Forget the one that you keep telling me that I've said I wanted.
The Music of Eric Zahn.
Yes.
The one about the crazy fiddler man.
I've read that one before. I've actually heard that one before, but yes, the man who fiddled himself to space. Devil went
Yeah.
up to Georgia.
And I've never read it before because it's supposed to be one of his worst
Right.
stories. We're all like, maybe we should read Cool Air, the one where he's like, I don't trust those air conditioners. They're inherently evil. Or, I don't know. Like I said, we might have a poll. Leave your suggestions. Most of his stories really short. So we're probably going to do a compendium of just a whole bunch of Lovecraft stories because this will come out in October for Halloween. Leave those down below. Did you guys have any final words for this?
Just enjoy the ride, man.
Did you bring your towel?
Don't panic.